Hello, listeners. Welcome to the Cultural Exchange. I am Stanley Miller, the grad assistant at the Center for Multicultural Affairs here at Duke University.
And I am Lorenna Garcia-Bochas. I'm also a graduate assistant at the Center for Multicultural Affairs.
Yes, and what you're about to hear is our insightful conversation with Dr. Adriane Lentz-Smith, a professor in the history department here at Duke.
Yes, we talked about her upbringing, what drew her to history, but also just important events that are taking place now in society and just her opinions on them.
Yes, and we talk about so much of her work and her research and just really dived into the thoughts that were provoked through reading her work. And my oh my, was it a great conversation, a really insightful conversation. So enjoy.
Yeah, enjoy.
Well, hello, viewers. I'm Stanley Miller, grad assistant at the Center for Multicultural Affairs, and I'm here with my colleague,
Lorenna Garcia-Bochas, also working at the Center for Multicultural Affairs.
Yes, and thank you for tuning in with us today. We have here Dr. Adriane Lentz-Smith of the Department of History here at Duke University, and we're very excited to be interviewing her here today. Thank you very much for having us.
Well, thank you for having me.
And just to let you know how we're going to approach the interview is we'll start with some of your work, and then we'll go into like your career experience and just your path as a professor and your academic career. Well, firstly, what stood out to me is I know that you are from Atlanta, and a lot of your work, of course, centers on Black freedom struggle and the civil rights movement and Black lives in modern America. And as we all know, Atlanta is one of the major centers and considered the cradle of the civil rights movement, right?
Yeah.
And I'm interested. Does being from Atlanta, has it impacted how you've approached your research area? And if so, can you explain?
Yeah, I think it has. We moved to Atlanta when I was 10 years old,
Okay.
to the Atlanta area when I was 9 years old. My father had been in the Army, so we moved around Texas and Georgia and landed in Atlanta in late elementary school. And so I think definitely, and my parents are born in northern Louisiana, so I've lived in many Souths, and I think there's something about that, first and foremost, living across a region that has many shared characteristics but is different from place to place has shaped me a lot. But I think even more, I got to Atlanta in the mid 1980s when the people who were the classic figures from the civil rights movement, many of them were still alive and they were still doing things, and their presence was kind of taken for granted, and the knowledge of that history was taken for granted. And so I grew up with it as the kind of the wallpaper of my life, but without the stories really told to me. So I had to go to college in Massachusetts, outside of Atlanta, to learn the civil rights history, excuse me, to learn the civil rights history that had taken place all around me. And I think there's something about that kind of like having a feel for it, but then like learning it elsewhere that shaped the way that I see things and ask questions. The other thing that being from Atlanta has done for me is that I'm from a small town outside of Atlanta that is convinced that it is where Gone with the Wind, where Tara would be, right? If Gone with the Wind were real, which means our football stadiums were Tara Stadium and 12 Oak Stadium. There was a Scarlett O'Hara lookalike contest in the mall when I was in high school. There was this kind of fantasy and romance of moonlight and magnolias and these kind of like the romantic old South in a land that had, like, again, civil rights history, which already tells you that there was something about the South that was not romantic, and a lot of Black people. And yet I still remember the time in high school when I was like, I don't know, y'all, like, I think Sherman was kind of efficient, which is a very cavalier way to speak of like the razing of ground and civilian deaths. But what I was trying to say was, why are we presuming that we're all lamenting the loss of the South in the Civil War? And it brought conversation among my classmates to a halt. And that was the first time that I was like, oh, there's a way that you can get people so enlisted and invested in a story that they don't even begin to think past their investment to what the implications of that story might be for the people who live through the reality of it. And so it's kind of that shaped my sensibility as a historian.
Right, and that's interesting that how you talk about, even though you grew up in a city that's known for being a city that was, heavily leaders, in terms of the civil rights movement, it took for you to move outside of Atlanta to really get that insight that's really instrumental in your work.
It's true.
I
mean, there are a lot of things you take for granted, right? And some of that's bad, like, oh, we don't have to tell the young people the history, like either, they'll just absorb it, and then we don't. But there are things that I also really appreciate about it. I remember moving to Boston and being like, well, this city's weird. Like, there's not like, well, okay, flat, period. But even if we're not going to stop that, for me, it was, there's no, like, large Black middle class, and there's not a Black sort of political kind of infrastructure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I moved to San Francisco, and of course I was moving to San Francisco behind processes of gentrification that had pushed many of its Black population out of the city. But again, I was like, this city is really weird. Like, where's the Black middle class? And Willie Brown was the mayor, so there was a Black mayor, but there wasn't like the sort of like collection of Black politicians. Then I moved to another place, and I was like, where are they? And then one day I was like, maybe it's not that every other city departs from the norm. Maybe it's that Atlanta set me up to expect a kind of heterogeneity and Black mobility that other American cities weren't necessarily replicating.
That's interesting. And I lived in Rhode Island, we're close to Boston, and I also went to UGA. In Athens, so I had to go to Atlanta a lot, and it was interesting to me, like you said, like the rich Black history is so accessible that it is probably easy to take it for granted. I remember being at events and I was just so amazed to see Andrew Young and and somebody I learned about and had a chance to meet him. So it's so rich in history, but like you said, like sometimes when you're so close to something, to understand the significance, you have to be away from it.
I spent a lot of time in southern Rhode Island, close to the Connecticut border, and there I was like, does South County have no Black people? Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
And that's changed in the 25 years that I've been going to westerly Rhode Island. But it still doesn't look anything like, well, even New Haven, Connecticut, never mind.
I also lived there as well. I taught at New Haven Academy.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, substitute history teacher for
You're just following me.
I know, isn't he?
I know, that's such a coincidence. But yes, that's interesting that you speak of those names. I was like, I had to ask her about being from Atlanta and your research area, because I'm sure that has to that is a dynamic that's
it's
profound.
the thing that taught me that the South was the thing to be studied. Right, and my curiosity about the civil rights movement or about the Black freedom struggle broadly led me to do more as an undergrad to learn about it. Like, how come I don't know this already? And then that growing curiosity is what led me into graduate school, which essentially I just never left.
Right, and so speaking of the Black freedom struggle, and I know that you in your work you talked about World War I and encounters of Black troops during World War I, how that kind of led to a mobilization in terms of the civil rights movement, right? And why do you think World War I, but also you talked about with World War I, how that experience led to some encounters that led to a reworking of ideas and notions of belonging and citizenship, right? Would you mind expanding on that? Like, what was it about the World War I experience of Black troops that you think led to this, that was so impactful in terms of like how the civil rights movement was mobilized?
Well, so I think it's a few things. One, with World War I, which would be the case on an even bigger scale with World War II, and had been the case in wars before, you have people who are willing to give their well-being and even their lives on behalf of a nation that is working very hard to keep them from grasping all possibility of not just citizenship rights, but all kinds of human rights, right? And they feel the kind of irony and tragedy of that on a daily basis. So Rayford Logan, who was an officer in World War I, would go on to be a great historian, right? Rayford Logan writes in his memoirs that he fought 2 wars at once, his own and Woodrow Wilson's, and he never was sure which one did more damage to him, right? So when I talk about him in talks or sort of public things, I talk about him as having a kind of Jim Crow shell shock. And for Logan, he stayed in Europe after the war and had to stay there for years until he had basically exercised all of his resentment and hatred, right, of the people who had treated him so very unjustly, right? And so there's the ways in which the heartache of being willing to die, of seeing your friends die for a country that is actually, like, say, not just lynching folks back at home, but are lynching soldiers even as they're overseas, that makes a kind of political consciousness that says we need to do something differently, right? So there's that part. I also was always really interested in people who went out into the world and discovered that the world was bigger than the things that they already knew. And so for Black soldiers, the question for me was, what does it mean to go into this war that is a world war, that is an imperial war, and see all of these people from all over the world and try to just figure out, like, who are they in relation to me? What is my place? And is there a kinship that is born of shared experiences, of, you know, whatever vernacular expression of white supremacy we have in our own locales, or experience of white supremacy in our own locales, of Afro descent, if it is that, of being subject peoples, if it is that, right? But knowing that that's not a kind of automatic feeling of connection, but that people kind of looked over and some of them started thinking, how do I think a path to you that has meaning for me personally and might have meaning for my community more broadly? Soldiers allowed a way into thinking about that. Folks like W.E.B. Du Bois, right, or kind of famous intellectual figures, they were one access point that I'd already gotten through other reading in college, but like most people are not W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah.
You know, so what do everyday people who don't have a language of Pan-Africanism, like how do they begin to conceptualize first diasporic identity and then perhaps some kind of solidarity or connection that feeds its way up towards liberatory politics.
Interesting. And of course your work looked at these themes in the capacity of gender as well. And you talk about a Black woman's struggle for civil rights, but also with the your work on, you know, the troops, Black troops during World War I. You mentioned about notions of manhood and citizenship, and that stood out to me. You talked about the experience of Eli Green and how he encountered members of the 24th Infantry and asked them if they felt being a soldier gave them any respect, and you know how someone answered, "Hell yes, when you're in uniform, you are a man, and that you have to be a man essentially to serve the government." And it makes me think about it seems that there was this idea from some you know, some of the troops that were in a part of this encounter that, you know, being a soldier led to afford some type of upper mobility in the caste system and regarded and, you know, kind of overrode a Blackness to some degree. And another thing that you said that stood out to me was, and I quote, "Whatever manhood might come to me during the war or after white supremacists assisted, the concept would never include African Americans. Neither then could full citizenship." That was really profound to me. You know, because not only were we talking about citizenship and belonging, but also manhood, and how was that kind of these ideas? How was that we worked, or what did that kind of open up in terms of what the troops were feeling from that experience of being in World War One? Could you mind expanding on that a bit?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the first things we need to understand is that kind of the idea of what it was to be a citizen, to be a person with rights, legal and otherwise, was so wound up in kind of gendered conceptions, right?
Okay.
So that manhood and citizenship were of a piece, and soldiering as a route to rights was bound up in both of those things. Women who were also kind of pushing at constraints and pushing at these strictures at the same period looked for different ways to intervene in that, right? Black women were very vocal and clear that, okay, we can talk in a language of manhood and citizenship, but manhood comes also with responsibilities to the race as a whole, including us. So your push for manhood is also about opening doors for Black womanhood. And sometimes they talked in the language of protection, right? Protecting Black womanhood from the predations and indignities of a sort of broader racist system. But that was sort of all in there too. And for white women and white men, the links between manhood and citizenship and between white supremacy and white manhood were such that white men were responsible for protecting white womanhood, which they saw Jim Crow as doing, keeping Black men and white women apart, attacking Black men when they saw white women as being under threat. But it was also about white women staying in their place so that they didn't upset the balance of anything. So one of the reasons that manhood is so salient is because white supremacy is a patriarchal system that is about controlling everybody and keeping them in tight little spaces. And you mess with anything. You mess with gender identity. You mess with gendered behavior. You mess with like who has access to the franchise or not, and you're disrupting the whole kit and caboodle. And there's an illusion, there's a narrative of stability, but all of these things are unstable, right? As all of identity is always unstable. And at the turn of the 20th century, in this period of industrialization and migration and immigration and urbanization, like all of those things are already kind of in flux. And so the response of people trying to protect the status quo, segregationist among them, is to try to lock them down. And one of the strategies of people who are trying to bust open possibility is to turn that instability to their own ends.
That is so powerful. That is so powerful. And this line, I just have to say this. You said in your book, and I quote, in securing manhood for white men alone, Jim Crow also worked to secure the market, the bottom, and the ballot. End of quote. That was just important. That was profound to me.
I spent a lot of time when I first started teaching. I think it's more visible to people now, maybe. And this book is from the sort of early part of my career, in trying to get folks to understand that Jim Crow and white supremacy, broadly speaking, is not simply about like separate water fountains. You know, like I think that the shorthand is like, oh, they were so rude. They didn't let people like sit on the lower floors in the movies. And it's like, well, that's true. And that is a performance of subservience and and subordination. But we also need to remember the terrorism and the murder. We need to remember that this was about like pushing people out of politics, and we need to remember that it was about disciplining labor and sending resources in very specific directions, right? Which is to say, a system of political economy with an ideology wrapped around it, in part to obfuscate what that system of political economy was doing and how few people had actually benefited.
Right. Like you said, it's not just the interpersonal aspect, right? But there's political and economic dynamics to it. It's deeper than the interpersonal
Yeah.
engagements that represented that segregation. It's actually protecting power, right, and privilege. So it's deeper than that. But also, I want to get into your work on Black women's struggle for civil rights. You talk about sexual violence against Black women, to subjugate Black women. You talk about Henrietta Wright and how Wright was targeted for her civil rights activism, and how sheriffs who invaded her home pointed a gun to her. Would follow, as you said, and I quote, "This underscored how fully white Southerners facilitated together sexual violation and criminalization as weapons for Jim Crow arsenal," right?
Yeah.
End of quote. And he said the prosecutors described her as violent, as their defense. And the experiences of racism as a common microaggression, aggressive. Yeah. We see this in history, but we see how this plays out.
So the historian Glenda Gilmore has talked about the protean nature of white supremacy, which is not to say that like the way that white supremacy is organized or the way that power works is the same now as it was in 1965, as it was in 1890. It's to say that challenges to white supremacy of all kinds force power to remake itself and to adapt, and in that remaking, pull from the material that worked in the past. And so the linking together of kind of sexuality and a threatening sexuality, whether you're talking about Black men as the sort of like, you know, the rapist threat, or whether you're talking about Black women as hypersexualized and thus the opposite of white women in need of protection, and somehow sort of supercharged and aggressive, somehow, you know, like drawing the sort of like the anger and the lust from a white aggressor, right? That those things, that kind of narrative did work when people were basically beating and arresting Henrietta Wright for registering to vote after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, or whether people are trying to re-narrate someone like what's her name, Sandra Bland, right, as an issue, or whether you're talking about just like delegitimizing women standing on the public stage today. Right? They draw on old tropes. Because those tropes have continued.
They keep going after Kamala.
And there's
keep going after her.
And it plays on the subconscious biases.
Yeah, and they're subconscious because they've been repeated for so long that like you can do narrative shorthands in your attack because everybody knows what the symbology is.
They know what it means, right? That they know it's believable because of how it's been repeated and it's subconsciously ingrained. So it's a common. It feels familiar. It feels familiar. That is so interesting, and you know, and you, like you mentioned, that Black men being seen as beasts. But like you said, and the sexual violence against Black women and to subjugate Black women, that is and deeming Black women as hypersexual, and how that was a part of Henrietta Wright's experience. And it's just, you see that is a history that is continuous in terms of like just repeating itself as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that I found so appalling and gripping about Henrietta Wright's story is precisely what you said, how current it feels. So this is a woman who, in Winona, Mississippi, and part of it, when you're a historian of the civil rights movement, like Winona means something because it's where Fannie Lou Hamer and folks were arrested and attacked. It's the story that she tells about being beat at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. But this is the following year. So Winona's already been called out, like on the national stage, and Winona is still Winona, right? But she registers to vote. A policeman follows her back to a cafe that she owns. So it's not just her home, it's her place of business. And they assault her, starting there, carry her back to the jail, continue to beat her. And then I think the part that is so chilling, and that also feels really current, is that the sheriff tells her, Henrietta, you're crazy if you think you're gonna vote, and then calls in a doctor to declare her mentally unfit, and then she is committed to the state mental hospital where she stays for 8 weeks, right? And so it's the ability to label someone something that has consequences for their sort of like ability to move out in the world or not, and the stigma that they will carry with them, and who knows, like the treatment that they might receive that will also do things with them, as an not arbitrary, like in some ways incredibly deliberate demonstration of power, and an innovative, like, oh, well, we can't do what we could before the 64 Act or the 65 Act. So what is the thing that we can do now to continue to keep people from pushing at the boundaries?
Interesting.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about this concept of the grand strategy.
Oh
yeah.
That stood out to me, that concept. And you used this concept in your 2020 article. Just for our viewers, can you just mind explain that for us, like the grand strategy?
So grand strategy is you call it a subset. It's part of the sort of discipline of security studies or international relations or diplomatic history that looks at the ways largely that high-placed policymakers have thought about pursuing their nation's interest. So American grand strategy. I mean, the kind of joke about American grand strategy is it's just basically like, what did Kissinger do? What did Kissinger say? What would WWHKD? What would Henry Kissinger do? Without actually a lot of the things that those of us who are social historians might talk about, like, I don't know, like the wanton destruction of people and places, human rights violations, and whether Kissinger should have been in jail before he died, right? So that's not fair, right? That there's grand strategy is bigger than that, but I think that there is one version of it that detaches the kind of chess game of it all from the moral considerations of it all. And so I wrote an article called The Unbearable Whiteness of Grand Strategy that was about both the field, which didn't I mean, again, all fields are changing all the time, right? But like, which didn't necessarily take seriously the actions, ideations, pursuits, and agency of non-elite, non-white actors, but then also the ways that historically, for a place like the United States, the construction of notions of nation and of security, what is a threat and what is not, were so bound up in the thought practices of white supremacy when people didn't even realize that that's what they were bound up in.
Interesting. Wow. That concept that says a lot. I like that stood out to me. I was like, I had to ask you about that. What does that mean? In terms of like for our viewers, I want them to understand that because it stood out to me. I wanted them to hear it from you.
That's right. We have I have friends and colleagues who are going to be like, that's your characterization of grand strategy? So it could be a little more supple than what I just did, but that's a quick.
Okay. Thank you. So we want to get into some of your just learning a lot about your path as an academic and your career journey, and we talk about your work, but we want to know Dr. Lentz-Smith. We want our viewers to know you.
Could you tell us more about sort of what made you get into this field, and then just what's inspiring you to keep going day after day?
Sure. I mean, so I have two versions of the answer to what encouraged me to get into this. So the first is that I went to nerd camp at Duke University, starting in 1987 through 1990, summer after 7th through the summer after 10th grade, and coming from a place where, good friends, very supportive childhood, and also felt a little bit like, people treated me a little bit like I was an alien, dropped forth into the middle. I was like, okay, there's a place where nerds have a home? I was like, and in that place, I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
Right? And I was like, how do I figure out a way to live here forever? And the answer to that question was academia.
Yes,
right?
academia.
That's one version.
Okay.
And then the other is things that I think I sort of was hinting at when I was talking about going to college outside of the South and being like, not everybody talks about things the way that I've learned to talk about things, right? So this deep and abiding curiosity about other people and how they've lived their lives, realizing that I love to read a letter or a diary, but that my older sister would kill me if I did that on hers, right? So I could find some in the archives and do it that way. But even more, a need to understand why people tell the stories about themselves that they do, people, communities, nations, and what work those stories do, right? And so that's what brought me in. And I remember, kind of still, even as a college student, getting good grades and sort of being into it, being like, yeah, but people like me don't go to graduate school. And you'd look over at like the person with the like tweed jacket and the suede patches, and you'd be like, those folks go to graduate school. Okay. But it turns out all kinds of people go to graduate school.
Right.
And I got left for 2 years. I had a job that was super fun that I didn't care about. And I realized that I'm not the kind of person who will continue to do a thing. I was like, someday I'm going to get fired because I'm already feeling indignant that people don't congratulate me for showing up every day. This is going to peter out. And so I was like, what is something that I can do that will continue to feed me over time? And for me, that was history. And so I went back to grad school. And I think that's actually the thing that continues to bring me delight and joy. Like, I like students. I like teaching. There's renewal because every class is a different kind of chemistry and subset of personalities. And then I think even more than that, I really love the teaching myself something by writing about it. I really love, again, that sort of innate nosiness and fascination.
It's okay to be nosy.
With how like self-contradictory and weird people are. And so trying to capture that and them and link them into these bigger contexts that reveal something about the human condition, like I think that's really powerful. And the nice thing about doing more than one research project in a lifetime is that, like, at some point, I've been writing a lot about really heart-wrenching things, and it's weighing on me. But I've already started to imagine the next project, which is far more joyful, right? So I get to go and throw myself into something else. That way too.
Wow, that's amazing. So, sort of to build up on that, how do you think sort of your place in academia? I'm sure there's struggles in academia for women of color, Black women. How have you navigated sort of academia, being a professor, doing research, having a family? How have you navigated doing that? And like, would you give any advice for someone who was thinking about being a professor, maybe not necessarily in your field, but just getting in that sort of arena?
So I think part of the advice, so one of the things I'll say is that it's a multi-part job, right? And it's happening in the midst of your like adulthood and all of the life of life. So there are a few things, like you have to take the job seriously, and you have to want to do it, and you have to know that you want to do it, even in the middle of those moments in graduate school that will happen again when you're a professor, where you're like, why did I do this to myself? And then you have to be like, oh, I chose this. I would choose it again. So do enough other things so that you know that you've chosen it, right? Don't default into it. Because that's and then even as you're taking it seriously and doing, writing the best that you can and, pursuing research in whatever way that your discipline has you pursue research, don't put your life on hold. I know too many people who are like, oh, after tenure, I'm going to do blah, blah, blah. No. And it's like, you don't magically become a different person after tenure. You're still you. And what if you don't get tenure? And then you've put your life on hold for things that you can't be sure are going to happen, right? So both living and being a scholar take up a lot of time, which means that somewhere along the way, there are things that you're not going to do. You need to figure out, in terms of service, where your strengths are and where they're not. do some work where you are able to offer something good. Have good reasons for saying no, but be sure that you're saying no. And don't get caught up in the ego trip. And this is something that I have to tell myself all the time, of thinking that like something can't happen if you're not part of it, right? That like one of the things that I told a colleague years ago that I realized I needed to be telling myself was, you're nowhere near as necessary as you think you are. Right?
Ooh.
And so it's like, you know, it hurts, right? Like, me? Why did I say that to me? But it's actually like, if you don't have a body of people that you think can do this work, go help nurture and produce a body of people so that you can spread that work around. And you know it'll get done if you're not the person desperately trying to do it. So get some balance, take your job seriously, and think of community as something that sustains you personally, but then also service-wise.
Wow, that's beautiful. Oh, wow. Okay, so I have another question. It's more current, more sort of what's going on. We see a lot of book bannings. We see a lot of people that don't really want to teach the whole history of things that happen in America. I was kind of wondering what your opinion was of those things. What did you think? What would happen, like maybe the next generation of students that comes up that hasn't learned all the history that needs to be learned? Ways that, how would you help educate this next generation that's coming up, and or maybe just some ideas of what do you think about what's going on?
Mercy, right? Like, so I think it's appalling and I think it's terrifying.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I also think the intensity of attempts to squelch like what is really the sort of like broad world of knowledge, and to reduce people's critical thinking skills, right? To kind of discipline people out of asking questions or having the skills to figure out where you go look for surprising answers to questions. Like that's what we're talking about. I think all of that is a response to the success of social movements that have lobbed challenges to the status quo. Right? So we see the reaction. In order to not be completely demoralized by that reaction, we have to think about the successes that spurred that reaction in the first place. What we do about it, besides like, I mean, the simple thing, which is like, we have to vote. I know too many younger people who are like, it doesn't do nothing, they're all corrupt. And I'm like, all right,
we hear that
people would not be trying this hard to keep folks from voting if voting didn't matter.
Exactly.
1, okay. 2, like, even if you're just doing it to honor the folks, the Henrietta Wrights and the John Lewises who got the tar beat out of them, then do it to honor people who tried. And if all you're doing is holding the line against worse, you are doing something mighty, because we've seen worse over and over again over the past several years, and worse is always worse than we can imagine. Right? So there's that. I also think we produce the scholarship. We do our best to make it available. It is there for somebody to find. You support your local libraries because you can shut down a lot of things.
I love my library.
But like,
I like going.
People will find their way to the knowledge. You sustain it, right? You figure out other ways to circulate it, and you always push back. Like I said this to the university one-on-one class on race yesterday. I was like, look, my job is not to make people feel better about themselves. And by people, I mean individuals, I mean nations. Like, my job is to get everyone to lean into the messiness and to be willing to think through complexity. Right? Like, we're not here for pablum or comfort. We're here to work. And just say that, right? Like, and again, I'm not here to tell people what to think. They might disagree with all of my takes on American history, but I am here to require them to think and to think through all of the evidence available to them, not just the stuff they like.
Wow. I'm gonna dive into messiness. I wanna dive into messiness. Okay. Wow. I'm trying to think. Okay, I have one more. This is my last question. What advice would you give to your younger self?
What advice?
To that girl that was at nerd camp,
so,
or the little girl thinking about history, talking to her friends, like, What advice would you give them?
So the one at younger camp is like, or younger super younger self is, you're not going to be like 14 forever.
Yeah.
And it turns out that like 34 is a lot better than 14. You know, that there's
it's great.
My cousin just said that.
And even 34 at this point was a long time ago for me. But like every stage and turn in life is a new thing with new possibilities.
Exactly.
So if you don't like where you are, give it some time. You'll be somewhere else, right? The other thing that I'll say to that person, or would say to that person, everybody's like, that part of you that is super weird, that you're self-conscious about right now, is kind of your superpower. So just hold on to it. Like, find the you. Like, stop trying to be somebody else. Just like, be you. Attuned to others and generous. Be as generous with yourself as I would push you to be with other people. Right? I think that works as a sort of human moving through the world. I think it actually works as a historian thinking about other folks. I think to my younger self as a scholar, as a college student, I'd be like, could you try reading all the books ahead of time? and go into the class. It turns out you know so much more what's going on when you do those things. But also to the grad student and then the scholar, like you don't have to like scale every mountain immediately. Like you're in this for the long haul.
Take your time.
So take your time and find a pace that is sustainable and not going to crush you, but that keeps you moving down the road.
Oh wow, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Wow.
I love that. So many profound quotes in there.
She
So
dropped
hold
a
on
lot.
to
She
it.
dropped a lot of gems. She dropped a lot of gems.
That's what I mean. You also said your answer to a question before the last question about this, I think you said the status quo or something about this attacking status quo in terms of the buying of the books. That stood out to me. It's just so many profound. It provoked so many thoughts. So many thoughts. But we thank you so much for taking time.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you. This was great.
To speak with us. I mean, like you said, I was just, so many things just resonated with us.
Yeah.
And I find that, there's, like you said, this is renewable. There's just always more to be discussed. Yeah. Always more layers to and we living at a time, like you said, we talk about buying books, but this is more important than ever.
Yeah.
These discussions are more important than ever. Yeah. So we can't take these discussions for granted. We can't. So we have to thank our viewers for watching this and taking time.
Thank you guys for watching.
Thank you for coming to the third floor. Nobody ever does.